It is Tuesday, December the 29th, 2020. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, How Not to Heal a Nation, 1857. Yeah, we're going to talk about some of the things that happened as 1856 became 1857. As our 2020 becomes 2021, that seemed familiar to me, or at least worth bringing up. And of course, before I get to all that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you, folks who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons, especially during the recovery period. Since I suffered my renal failure a couple months ago, I am feeling much better now. Good enough that I should be able to go back to work. Now, of course, it's the holidays right now. I'm going to take a little vacation on New Year's to come back feeling right as rain, I think. But of course, I will continue to nurse this little baby podcast of mine that I love so much and that you can support again at patreon.com/distantpeasant. Also, be sure to check out me on Twitch, along with my friends Bro and the Kentucky Fried Comrade. That's twitch.tv/postrevolution. We're doing our best to put time, effort, and a little bit of money to the production side of that channel to make it a real thing. And so your attention there be pretty appreciated by the three of us. On with the show. "1856 had been a turbulent year in American politics, a time when respect for the legitimacy of national institutions was sinking among its citizens, and nothing like an American way of life or values, even if we only limit ourselves to white people, seemed able to take hold. Franklin Pierce, the outgoing Democratic Party's president, was making history as the only incumbent president to ever seek his party's renomination to a second term and fail to receive it. In the debate over slavery, and in the main we are mostly talking about whether slavery shall be contained or expanded, not abolished, Pierce was seen by too many as accommodating to the slave power and replaced, particularly in matters regarding Kansas, which will bleed for the duration of this episode, as free staters and slave staters set up in opposition to each other in almost every way there, by living apart, setting up different governments, and killing each other, though by virtue of their numerical minority, terrorism and fraud was always far more tempting to the slavers, based on my opinion of the record. John Brown was in Kansas. Tensions were so hot that it was here and not at Harper's Ferry John Brown committed his most brutal and questionable act, when he and his followers killed 5 militant but unarmed pro-slavery settlers with broadswords north of Potawatomi, in retaliation for many crimes: for the brutality of their inhuman institution of racial slavery, for the murder of Brown's brother and one of his sons, for the arrest of another son, for the burning of the settlement at Osawatomie, and for the sacking of Lawrence and the destruction of the Free Staters' presses, hotel, and the house of their malicious commander-in-chief. As the pro-slavery squatter Sovereign put it, they, quote, are determined to repel this northern invasion and make Kansas a slave state, though our rivers should be covered with the blood of their victims, and the carcasses of the abolitionists should be so numerous in the territory as to breed disease and sickness, we will not be deterred from our purpose, end quote. Brown described his fellow Free Staters as cowards, or worse, in response, and shortly after unsuccessfully attempting to defend what was left of Osawatomie with a force of 40 against between 250 and 400 opponents, Brown withdrew from the area, but not from the struggle for black liberation. 2 days before Brown and his followers killed those 5 men, Brown had learned of the latest nationally sensational story then sweeping the country, the caning of Charles Sumner. Now, for my part, when I was a wee lad, this incident was pointed to as a quirky little symbol of increasing sectarian tensions over slavery in America, more as a bit of trivia than anything very consequential. This could be easy to swallow, for how can the caning of one old man in a legislature compare to the real forces of history, the great economic and social trends emerging from material conditions that create the ideologies necessary for one side to wage a war for freedom and the other for slavery? And all that's more true than not, but as a media event at least, it was a big one, and one which was very effective in helping people decide whether this Republican talk of the slave power was bunk or not. That is, are the South's most wealthy and powerful slave owners enjoying disproportionate influence in national government due to their right to count each slave as 3/5 of a person and their power in the Senate, as well as the simple fact that without them the Democratic Party nationally couldn't win any elections, using their influence to not just protect, but enshrine and even extend the right to hold humans in bondage, and are becoming ever more radical in their demands and actions. Senator Charles Sumner certainly thought so about all that, and said as much over May 19th and 20th, 1856, while addressing recent events in Kansas, and demanding it be admitted as a free state without delay. A sampling, quote, "Not in any common lust for power did this uncommon tragedy have its origin. It is the rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery, and it may be clearly traced to a depraved desire for a new slave state, hideous offspring of such a crime, and the hope of adding to the power of slavery in the national government," end quote. Sumner also, fatefully perhaps, targeted the specific authors of the act he was talking about. One of them, Senator from South Carolina Andrew Butler, quote, "The senator from South Carolina has read many books of chivalry, and believes himself to be a chivalrous knight, with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress, to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. For her, his tongue is always profuse in words. Let her be impeached in character, or any proposition made to shut her out of the extension of her wantonness, and no extravagance of manner or hardihood of assertion is then too great for this senator," end quote. Now, Preston Brooks was a good-looking young congressman of 37, and Andrew Butler's first cousin once removed. On May 22nd, 1856, Brooks and two accomplices waited for the Senate galleries to clear before Brooks approached Sumner at his desk. After calmly announcing in a low voice that his speech was a libel on his state and his relative, he beat Sumner severely on his head with a hard wooden cane topped with a gold head as he rose from his desk. Sumner was hit so hard he claims he lost his vision and senses almost immediately and fell to the floor, trapped under his desk and his chair. Brooks continued his wailing until Sumner finally ripped the desk from its floor bolts and vainly struggled to defend himself. His face was now covered in blood, and he staggered up the aisle, succeeding in nothing but making himself a larger and easier target for his assailant, who continued to beat him. Eventually, the cane broke from all this beating. This did not stop the assault. Brooks continued to bash Sumner with the gold head of the cane. Sumner lost consciousness. Brooks grabbed his lapel to keep him from collapsing and continued to beat him. Several senators and congresspeople attempted to intervene to stop the assault, becoming ever more desperate as it dawned upon them that Brooks might murder Sumner on the floor of the Senate. One of Brooks' accomplices drew a pistol and shouted at all to let them alone, goddamn you, let them alone. Sumner did not die, of course, but this was no ordinary beating. While accused by pro-slavery ghouls of exaggerating his injuries, in reality Sumner would suffer chronic and debilitating pain for the rest of his life, and would spend 3 years convalescing before returning to his Senate seat, which remained his for the duration. Doctors today would probably diagnose him with traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. Elections in 1856 were dominated by talk of bleeding Kansas and bleeding Sumner. As the New York Evening Post put it at the time, quote, "Has it come to this, that we must speak with bated breath in the presence of our Southern masters? Are we to be chastised as they chastise their slaves? Are we too slaves? Slaves for life, a target for their brutal blows when we do not comport ourselves to please them?" End quote. Sumner would become a potent martyr for the very new Republican Party and their Whig, Free Soiler, and American Party sympathizers, just as Brooks would become a hero to the South, receiving hundreds of replacement canes as gifts and being celebrated throughout his tour of the South. Talk of secession was already in the air that season, mostly among the fire eaters of the South, but also among a small, radical, and nonetheless influential faction of the Republican Party, its abolitionists. And yet, as 1856 became 1857, there was some hope in the political classes that rifts could be healed, and the Union yet preserved, and tempers dampered. Franklin Pierce, who remains the only man in history to actively seek his party's nomination for president and not receive it, like I said, was on his way out, widely seen then and now by history as weak, vacillating, and vulnerable to the influences of Southern extremists, notably his Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. Pierce had attempted to hand the slave power Kansas and Nebraska on a platter, nullifying the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and potentially opening up those territories north of the Mason-Dixon line to slavery, provided enough slavers moved there to vote it in. It was Pierce who first recognized the bogus and fraudulent elections for a pro-slavery territorial legislature in Kansas, giving support with pro-slavery judges and federal troops. But Pierce was gone. The Democrats nominated in his place James Buchanan, and people were moderately confident that under his steady leadership, things would calm down. Buchanan was a veteran political operative from Pennsylvania who was practiced at navigating the choppy waters produced by the competing interests of the northern and southern wings of the Democratic Party, a former Secretary of State, and conveniently serving as the ambassador to the United Kingdom during the turmoil in Kansas. He had achieved the two-thirds vote necessary at the convention to win the Democratic Party's nomination, and other than a few extremists in North and South, was widely seen as a man with whom most, if not all, could do business. The new Republican Party, campaigning on stopping the expansion of slavery into the territories and not yet wholesale abolition, was widely viewed as just as responsible for sectional crisis as the Southern Democrats, to many more so. Their defeat by the Democrats, where they were held to about a third of the popular vote and carried 11 of 31 states, was viewed as deliverance, for there were already organized and influential political forces in the South ready to lead their states into rebellion if Fremont was elected. On January 27th, 1857, news began to spread throughout the frozen and snow-covered capital that Sumner's assailant, Preston Brooks, was dead. Few would speak ill of the dead then, and some whispered that Brooks had been a decent man once, whose associations with the slave power had brutalized him. At that time, Kansas was back to relative peace again, with the arrival of a new federal governor. And for many people, all they thought was required was that a new election of qualified voters be held to elect delegates to a constitutional convention, who would then write a constitution and submit it to the voters for popular ratification, easy as pie, and a, quote, simple rule that the will of the majority shall govern, end quote, as Buchanan said in his inaugural speech. Now, he admitted in that same speech there were some quibbles about the proper time for the people of a territory to make their choice regarding government, specifically whether that government should allow slavery, but this was, quote, a matter of little practical importance, end quote. Furthermore, he said, that's all really a judicial question, and wouldn't you know it, Buchanan was sure that the Supreme Court would soon resolve this issue for good, and that he would cheerfully submit to whatever they decided. The nation's new president that March began to describe a vision of an administration dedicated to peace and harmony between all sections of the United States. Imagine, under the principle of popular sovereignty and a little court decision to fill in the gaps, quote, everything of a practical nature, end quote, regarding slavery would be settled. The Republican Party would be smothered in the cradle, and the Union would hold under these propositions, and that all agreed that slavery in the southern states was forever beyond the reach of the federal government. Yes, the Union could be preserved, provided all reasonable political factions agreed that it be built on racialized chattel slavery. I am always editorializing on this show in a sense, but here I want to be explicit and note that if keeping the Union together on such terms constitutes success for Buchanan in the judgment of history, it is no wonder he failed, and good that he did. For as he spoke, 4 million souls labored in the South under bondage because of the color of their skin, and a growing number of people in the North were beginning to recognize the moral outrage this constituted, and more broadly, how slavery and the incredibly unequal society it produced where it was practiced threatened the ability of free labor to make enough money to live decent lives. These dynamics would never simply vanish, whatever the Democrats wanted, but Buchanan, who won the day, would attempt to bring peace to everyone but slaves and Republicans by accommodating the South's squeakiest wheels and declaring all decent people satisfied. His real failure was not in bungling the job of bringing people together, but in bungling the job of who ought to be considered a person. Buchanan felt able to speak with confidence and optimism about the Supreme Court's ability to settle questions regarding slavery for good reason. He himself was then involved in the decision he was referencing. That case is known to history as Dred Scott v. Sandford, a case that originated more than a decade ago, if you start in 1857, in a suit for freedom for 4 Missouri slaves, Dred Scott, his wife Harriet, and their 2 daughters. Endless delays, postponements, rehearings, and appeals meant that even before the fog of history set in, the Scotts became to nearly everyone not people but a cause, and little thought is or was given to them. But at first, this was just a case of slaves who wanted freedom, and used their time in Illinois and Wisconsin territories, where slavery was illegal, to argue that they should not be considered slaves. The details and history of their case, as it wound through the court system, will be set aside here, and we will jump to the last stop, the Supreme Court of the United States, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney. Now, few people with any knowledge of the case at the time whatsoever thought that the court would rule in Scott's favor. Of the 9 justices sitting, 5, including the chief, were pro-slavery Southern Democrats, 2 were Northern Democrats, and 1 each Old Northern Whig and New Northern Republican, though by old and new I refer to the parties, not the men. And the case was heard not in the fragile peace of the first few months of 1857, but the turbulence of 1856, hot on the heels of Democrats North and South agreeing quite suddenly that Congress did not have the power to prohibit slavery in the territories, even though it had previously done so at least a half-dozen times, as well as denying the legitimacy of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Democrats at the time still disagreed among themselves about whether a territorial legislature could ban slavery prior to statehood, and it was this thorny issue that Buchanan referred to when he referenced the judiciary in his inaugural address, among others. It was curious, then, that the case, when it was first argued in front of the court, did not introduce these issues regarding territories at first. The plaintiff claimed freedom for his clients because of their time in the state of Illinois. The defense first argued that Scott was not a citizen and denied the court's jurisdiction over the case based on that issue, and only after 4 days of oral argument did the defense bring up the territorial question. But even then, it seemed doubtful the court would want to get involved in that, having many other avenues to render a decision denying Scott his freedom without declaring whole swaths of settled law unconstitutional. Primary historical evidence from Justice Curtis at the time indicates a majority of the justices were of this mind in April 1856, not to deal with the Missouri Compromise, but disagreed on the question of jurisdiction, and so ordered the case re-argued to consider the question of whether Dred Scott was a citizen of the United States or not. By this time, re-argument occurred in December of 1856, and its political significance had become far more clear to the press and to voters. They, at the court, were fast coming under pressure to render a decision that clarified the broader question of congressional power in a territory regarding slavery, as well as the power of a territorial legislature to prohibit slavery. And in previous cases, the Taney Court had rarely, if ever, shied away from rendering a pro-slavery decision in whatever case it could. 2 months passed before the next round of conferences among the justices began on February the 14th, 1857, just weeks before Buchanan's inauguration day, then in March and not in January as ours currently is. There were bare majorities on the court interested in leaving aside the question of whether black people could be citizens of the United States, as well as leaving aside the question of invalidating the Missouri Compromise and denying Congress the ability to prohibit slavery in the territories. But in the end, an opinion was produced, eliciting dissents from only 2 justices, that would have declared Scott's status was determined by the state of Missouri and not any other state or territory, and leaving things at that. But, a few days later, the 5 Southern justices on the court reversed course and became convinced that what the country really needed was a broad and firm resolution to the broader issues of the case. Whether any black person can be a citizen of the United States, whether Congress has the power to restrict slavery in the territories, and so on. Old historians used to blame Justices Curtis and McLean for all this, the dissenters, for preparing dissents favorable to Dred Scott's claim for freedom and covering the territorial question in the affirmative, but this all smacks of a bit of opportunistic revisionism to me. The southern wing of the Democratic Party was already rapidly coalescing around the idea that a strong decision favorable to the rights of slaveholders was just the medicine the country needed to rid itself of troublesome abolitionists and black Republicans. And they were about to do what they had always planned to do. In fact, their actions would have the opposite effect. Still, from these Southern justices' point of view, the authority and majesty of such a decision would be much less if it were made 5-4 and strictly upon regional lines. They needed at least one person to join them. Now, Nelson had already written an opinion he thought would be the court's, but the other Northern Democrat, Greer, could maybe be moved, and Greer just so happened to be from Pennsylvania, where President-elect Buchanan hailed from. That Buchanan was written to and asked for assistance, and apparently totally indifferent to the propriety or ethics of interfering in an independent judicial process, the president-elect agreed, just as eager to settle the question of what rights slaveholders possessed in America once and for all on terms pleasing to the South and acceptable to the North with regional cooperation. So correspondence began, and the president-elect was eventually informed, to his delight, that the court would produce a binding opinion on slavery in the territories, but that a Northern Democrat or 2 still needed leaning on. Buchanan worked his end and eventually convinced Justice Curtis of the importance of avoiding sectional divisions on the court, and along with Nelson, who did end up joining the opinion and just writing a concurrence, constituted the 7-2 decision usually reported, even as the majority side produced one opinion in 6 concurrences, and which parts precisely of Justice Taney's opinion had a majority behind them and which did not was unclear. But regardless, Buchanan knew the ability for Congress to legislate regarding slavery in the territories, as well as the ability for a territorial legislature to prohibit slavery, was about to be struck down. Through a combination of this correspondence, his conversations with people close to the justices, and perhaps getting a hold of Taney's opinion in advance, or finally, the very obvious whispered conversation he and Chief Justice Taney enjoyed at the inauguration ceremony just before the oath of office was administered. The Union would hold, and the problem of those who wouldn't accept the expansion of slavery solved, by making the Republican Party's central campaign issue unconstitutional. For if slavery can't be prohibited, it will be allowed. So, Taney's opinion, which did end up being considered by most binding, regardless of questions surrounding which exactly of his points he had a majority for, which he didn't, held basically three things. Thing one, black people can't be citizens of the United States, whatever any state says about them being citizens of that state. Thing two, Congress does not have the power to ban slavery in U.S. territories. The Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Thing three, the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment prohibits the federal government from freeing slaves brought into federal territory. This last point was very much thought to be a backdoor on the way to recognizing the freedom of slaveholders to bring their so-called property wherever they might wish in the United States, whatever the state or territory. Now, I won't bore you with the details, but there was and is ample historical evidence to dispute each of these conclusions by Taney. He made them up out of whole cloth, cloth supplied to him by the fanciful dreams of the Southern planter class. By the end of 1857, this decision will have done much to convince an ever greater number of Northerners that the slave power was real. It was not simply defensive, and it was a threat to their ideas of freedom and liberty for themselves, as well as the nation's enslaved people. In the meantime, the early months of 1857 were also actually a time of economic optimism. Railroads and land speculation were all the rage, and a flood of immigrants west had resulted in huge boons in agricultural production. But, as is inevitable under capitalism, bubbles develop in markets, and an overproduction inevitably occurs. While amazing marvels of humanity, the monetary returns on many of those railroads failed to reach the astronomical heights predicted. In addition, many promised railroads failed to materialize at all. And in both of these cases, the land surrounding those proposed railroads began to tumble in value, land that had already changed hands in speculative frenzy many times over. War in Europe earlier that decade meant increased demand for American farm products at a time when production outpaced domestic demand. But peace brought an end to those conditions and left many a farmer in trouble, as prices for their food tumbled. Financial panic began that year when the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, despite its name actually a bank, suspended payments. Now, they lied about why, which turned out to be part embezzlement and part incredibly speculative railroad bonds, but this kicked off a wider financial panic, forcing most banks throughout the North to suspend payments for months. People argue about the relative importance of these or other events in the Panic of 1857, probably humanity's first general and worldwide economic crisis, but it is generally agreed by all that this kicks off a massive recession that the U.S. won't totally recover from until the beginning of the Civil War. Thousands of businesses in the cities failed, not all of them big and controlled by rich men who would land on their feet, and of course this put a lot of people out of work. In fact, so many people were out of work that some of the first calls for public employment programs began to be heard in American cities, as tens of thousands of bookkeepers, clerks, mechanics, factory workers, domestics, day laborers, and others like that became very rapidly unemployed, though more often they just received advice to give up tobacco and strong drink, wear last season's clothes, consume only the plainest foods, austerity politics. As usual, charity at the time was not enough, and except for a few scattered calls for those public employment programs, and stale old debates about banking and protectionist trade policies, politics really provided no relief for the situation. People instead turned to morality and religion. Now, abolitionists and some other clergy urged people to consider their society's increasingly urbanized, industrial, and commercial nature, and its partnership with the Southern slave power. Others focused more banally on the rampant fraud, dishonesty, and extravagance of the preceding years of prosperity. And indeed, many a bank and railroad company was caught not just in a general downturn, but had themselves been run incredibly fraudulently, usually in the name of speculative profits. These feelings among people were strong and widespread enough in parts of the North that a general Christian revival movement happened, the last in a series of antebellum Protestant revivals in the United States. This revival was peculiar in a few ways. It attracted more men than is typical, and more adherents of the sedate Episcopalian and Unitarians and the like, and not just your excitable Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. Calling it a businessman's revival was probably going a bit too far, but it did have more of those sorts, lawyers, merchants, bankers, and physicians, than is typical. They were all anxious, not just about the economy, but I think life in America generally. Caught up in talk about individual piety and the promotion of temperance and simple Protestant values, was talk about restoration of harmony between the sections, and the renewal of America as a nation of godly people, which encouraged those same Americans to look with critical eye at their nation's ruling class and its values. With time, more and more people in the North will recognize that peace with men who believe it is godly to own slaves really means the end of harmony, and the end of equality before God. Much else happened in 1857 that was of national importance, particularly violence and political fraud and malfeasance surrounding Kansas's entry into the Union, which would also reveal that the Democratic Party's commitment to popular sovereignty regarding slavery to be a sham, and make clear that slave owners in the South were determined to expand their barbaric institution by hook or by crook and force a constitution upon Kansas that allowed slavery, whatever a majority of people there thought of it. But it is fair to ask what I'm trying to get at with all this, if anything. Is Joe Biden like James Buchanan? Is America as 2020 becomes 2021 like America as 1856 became 1857? Are we headed towards a sectional crisis? And if so, is it inevitable or not? I think not exactly is the answer to all those questions, for times are quite different now in many important ways, and our political divide is less strictly regional. Our economy and monetary system completely different, and the threat of civil war between the states incredibly remote, to take just a few examples. But if I thought there was nothing to all this, I don't know that I'd have much of a point in making this episode. I have a few fears that history is about to rhyme in some small ways at least. Joe Biden, while now a nearly senile husk, is nonetheless like Buchanan, a trained statesman, or was, adept, or was, at placing himself at the center of the Democratic Party. And then as now, the reactionary wing of the Democratic Party is asserting its power, and attempting to exclude opponents from not just the parties, but the American political system. The abolitionists and free soilers and old Whigs and American Party members had the new Republican Party to organize into. No such option exists for us on the left, such as we are, at the time of this writing. But it is true that both Biden and Buchanan, when they were planning their administrations at least, viewed their primary goal as bringing the nation together by accommodating its most reactionary forces, the Southern Democrats in 1857 and the Republican Party in 2021. The Supreme Court may not have such an obvious parallel to today. Dred Scott goes down in history as the worst decision of all time, in fact. And true, in 1857, the court was dominated by Southern slave owners and their sympathizers, just as the presidency was. But today's court will not be allied with Biden, as dough-faced Buchanan's was. Buchanan was able to proclaim that he would cheerfully submit to whatever the court decided because he knew what it was about to decide. Whereas in Biden's case, he will woefully submit to whatever unpopular and immiserating decision our court renders for the sake of our constitutional system. Off the table will be any constitutional remedies to the situation, like adding any justices to the court. This would make Republicans uncomfortable. There will be no practical difference between these approaches. In 1857, bringing the nation together meant excluding the black people of the North, free soilers, and abolitionists, and most egregiously, the nation's millions of slaves toiling in the South. In 2021, I fear bringing the nation together means excluding the literal and symbolic descendants of those very same groups from our political system, the nation's black people and its other non-white citizens as well as its younger working class population, whatever their identities. And if the Supreme Court in 2021 has to do the dirty work of finding a way to codify that, it will be as it ever was. The panic of 1857 and the reaction to the resulting economic recession rings a bit familiar to me, though the timing is off. Now, neither the source nor effect is quite then the same as our economic depression today, yet as banks suspended payments and thousands were thrown out of work in 1857, what is worrisome to me then and now is that people turned not to the collective action of government to alleviate their suffering, but to charity and spirituality. Now, I don't want to knock spirituality generally, but its substitution for secular action bothers me. There is an increasing sense across broad swaths of people in the United States that something isn't quite right, that our institutions are almost totally unresponsive to popular pressure, and that these economic problems are not problems the government can or should do anything about. In response, magical thinking has arisen, and while some of it is mostly harmless, it's also inspired some serious pathologies, especially on the right, when manifested in the real world, that can have serious consequences. And certainly none of that is useful for building a more just and socialized human society. But what most broadly rhymes to me is the general sense around Biden and his administration's goals. Buchanan and Biden both envision healing the sectional divide by making our nation's most racist and reactionary forces more comfortable and thus less radical in their demands. It did not work in 1857. It will not work in 2021. But more than all that, after preparing this episode, I'm not sure these are things anyone should cheer for anyway. Success then and now would mean more orderly transitions for our country's never-ending quest to give people less and make them work more, for this is what capital demands, and other than perhaps a few delaying hiccups along the way, the trend would never be corrected. 4 years after 1857, a reckoning was at hand, and the bloody crimes of this guilty land were partly purged away with yet more blood, to paraphrase John Brown. I do not predict a civil war, even as I worry about more limited acts of violence in this country, and I don't want one. And for what it's worth, I don't relish bloodshed. I like peace and comfort for me and for all. For another thing, though, I think your average American citizen just seems a bit too preoccupied, beaten down, disempowered, or alienated to really view their conditions as a result of political decisions and fight some sort of war over it. Though I also get the sense that this is less the case than in the recent past, and that, like in 1857, things are quite a bit more volatile than they might appear on the surface. Southern reactionaries in the 1850s and Republicans today both rely upon the disposability of human beings. And as capitalism advances, crises become more frequent, and the tendency for the rate of profit to decline continues. Who is disposable, and who must thus be politically neutralized in some way, always expands, never contracts. To accommodate such people in our system might sometimes bring peace and stability, but for an ever smaller number of beneficiaries. What is needed instead is a populist reckoning with such forces that results in their defeat, or at least their diminution. May such a reckoning speedily and peacefully come for us in 2021, starting in the Democratic Party. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. A little bit of a grab bag. I probably could have gone on more and more about 1857, but I think you get the drift. I'm incredibly worried and anxious, and I think other people should be too, if they want to pay attention to this stuff, about who exactly Joe Biden is looking to make happy with his governing style. Patreon.com/DisneyPeasant is how you support the show. Don't forget the Twitch channel at twitch.tv/postrevolution. I want to tell people, if you're not a Twitch kind of person, we are the channel for you. Like we're actually trying to bring something a little bit different to Twitch than maybe a lot of your classically popular streamers who talk about politics there. It's a much more chill vibe, and it's just a different platform for us to get things out more easily. So again, that's twitch.tv/postpostrevolution, patreon.com/distant peasants. How you support the show. I will see you next year.